So we have Ben Franklin writing this satire. We have Thomas Jefferson sending Marines overseas. And finally, we need to look at 1821, right? This is the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And it's important because it takes place in an exchange between the Greeks and the Ottomans, right? It may seem silly to consider Greece part of the Middle East or even the Balkans, but you have to remember at this time the Ottoman Empire is stretched throughout this region we know as the Middle East. There is no Middle East until after World War I, when these countries have either colonialized by the British or France or later declared independence. But at this time, we have the Ottoman Empire. It stretches from Baghdad and Arab Iraq all the way up into the Balkans and in Greece, and then all the way west to Morocco. So it's this great swath of territory. And 1821 is essential because we have the Greeks rebelling for the first time against the Ottomans. This is the beginning of the Ottoman decline. Remember, Nicholas I of Russia, during the Crimean War, was the first to say that the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. He was decrepit and he was slowly breaking apart. And this Greek rebellion is the first instance of this. It's also important because for those of you that are familiar with Sam Huntington's argument in The Clash of Civilizations, this area of the Balkans that connects Greece and Kosovo and Albania and Bosnia with Turkey is one of these civilizational fault lines. Huntington argues that it's one of these areas where, because of the cultural, religious, economic, political differences, there's a natural prone tendency to conflict. And we see this as early as 1821. And you have the Greeks rebelling against the Ottomans, and American statesmen love this. They create a discourse of the Greeks, right, the founders of democracy, and Christians. They're Orthodox for the most part. Some are Catholic, but primarily Orthodox. They're rebelling against these Muslim rites, so they're pagan, they're autocratic, and it's just perfect discourse for American statesmen. And most people don't know that our political heroes, Lincoln's political heroes, certainly Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, are in the Congress proposing military intervention in Greece. They want to send our warships to the port of Piraeus, there in the Aegean Sea, to aid the Greeks in rebelling against the Ottomans, which is just amazing. And there's a perfect quote from the frontier general, our future President William Henry Harrison. And Harrison is quoted as saying, "Humanity, policy, religion all demand it. The Star-Spangled Banner must wave above the Aegean." As early as 1821, we see that Americans agreed with notions of protecting and spreading democratic freedom abroad. This discourse that we think is either an evil construction of the Bush administration or perhaps Reagan or before that really exists as early as the 1820s. So now we see these three anecdotes are all important. They show that we were interested in protecting our national interest abroad. We were also interested in primarily with defining our own sense of freedom, but also protecting that, especially to our kinsmen, the Greeks, who are the founders of democracy back in antiquity. So we have these tastes and these stories and anecdotes about America's experience. Now we need to look at Lincoln's foreign policy with the Middle East. And I'm going to start with the Ottoman Empire because it was based, right, its headquarters was in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and that's where the centralization of power of the whole empire was in this elegant bureaucracy of you have statesmen, military rulers, and administrators for the whole empire. And one of the crucial diplomatic victories that we often don't think about is Seward. In 1861, at the beginning of the war, goes to the Ottoman port, the Ottoman government, and secures Ottoman neutrality in the conflict. We often don't think about that. We think of the neutrality of the Brits and the French, but the Ottomans were a world power, even if they were slowly starting to decline. So we see that the Turks, they have sympathy for rebellion at home with the Greeks, with their experience with the Greeks. Now, we need to go back and remember that the U.S. did not send any military aid. It was more of an ideological connection. We never sent troops there. But the Turks have a native experience of this rebellion and internal division at home. And in this exchange between the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and Lincoln, the Sultan says, we hope that your conflict resolves itself with the Union still intact. So you have Ottoman sympathy. You also have the renewing of a commercial treaty in 1863. This actually renews our trading relations that had happened during Andrew Jackson administration in the 1820s with the Ottoman. It renews this, and there's an essential clause as well that they will capture and prosecute Confederate privateers, which shows that outside of the continental United States we have these naval encounters with the Union and the Confederacy, more precisely these Confederate pirate ships that would capture Union commercial interests. And so we have first a support of Ottoman neutrality in the conflict, and then we have a promise that they'll capture Confederate vessels. Outside of Constantinople, we also have the U.S. engaging the Barbary states. We have an example of the Trent Affair. It's kind of this Middle East or Arab version of the Trent Affair. In 1862, we have 2 sailors from a Confederate vessel, a privateering ship, land in Tangier in modern-day Algeria to do some sightseeing before returning back to Gibraltar to restock their ship and continue their marauding. They stop, and the U.S. consulate there, led by an ambassador or a statesman by the name of James DeLong, hears about these Confederate rebels landing in Tangier and immediately sends out a contingent to arrest them. And he's furious that these Confederates can have free reign in a town that has a Union or a United States consulate. And what's interesting about this diplomatic exchange is that it infuriated the French. At this time, we see with Napoleon III and the French bureaucracy, we see them interested in imperialism in North Africa. And so they had their hand already in North Africa, even though technically the Barbary states were part of the Ottoman Empire. And so we have the French saying, this is exactly the same as the Trent Affair, which happened only 6 months before. You're arresting Confederate diplomats in neutral territory. You can't do that. And so Lincoln ends up having to back down, and he releases these 2 sailors to prevent French allegiance with the Confederacy over this Trent-like affair in North Africa. And finally, what's interesting is the United States also had a unique foreign policy with Egypt, who was also a part of the Ottoman Empire but was autonomous. The French in the earlier part of the 19th century invaded Egypt and put a colonial stakehold in that as well. And U.S. relations with Egypt were thus tied in with foreign policy to the great powers, primarily Britain and France. During the Union blockade at the beginning of the war, there was an economic slump for the South. They can't get out their cotton exports, and this has a direct impact with the British, who relied overwhelmingly on cotton exports to run their textiles. They had an economy based on agrarian imports from the South, and with that gone, there's a real threat that the British would either destroy the blockade or ally themselves with the Confederacy to get access to this cotton. Interestingly, though, with what happens in Egypt is they're already growing cotton, and the Union encourages them to increase their exports. So from 1861 to 1865, we have a 350% increase in cotton exports to the UK, from 60 million pounds in 1861 to 274 million pounds. So the British now, as well as mainland Europe, have access to a new source of cotton. So economically, they're not dependent on a confederacy for agricultural exports. So once again, we see the United States is, with their foreign policy with the Middle East, is tied to the great powers. On the French side, the Arab viceroys, these rulers who were pledged allegiance to the Ottomans but were also influenced by the French. And there's an interesting encounter there as well. We have Napoleon III invading Mexico right in the 1860s, 1863. He's looking at establishing a new empire, so he sends the French troops there and is going to make a territorial stake in Mexico. And really, Lincoln and Seward's hands are tied at this point to be able to deal with that. Interestingly enough, most people don't know that there are 500 Egyptian troops on. It's the first time we've had Muslim Arab soldiers invade, if you will, the United States. And they were warring or allied with the French, and Napoleon loved this because he thought that they were Sudanese, but they were a part of the Egyptian area. And he thought that they would be resistant to the heat of Mexico, and they'd also be resistant to yellow fever. And ironically enough, most of them did not die in combat, but died of yellow fever. And so once again, we have this kind of schizophrenic relationship with the U.S. and Egypt, whereas we are supporting their cotton exports, and that secures British neutrality, but the Egyptians send troops to North America, and so that puts in danger our relationship with the French.